Rain had a smell that Nelson Hartman could never quite separate from memory. It hit him every time. The moment petrichor rose from warm pavement, something old and buried would stir behind his ribs, pressing against the cage of his chest like it needed more room than his body could offer. He had never known why. Not until the afternoon he spent cleaning out his late grandfather's study and found the box under the floorboard. He almost missed it. He almost left the room. The study had been accumulating dust for 11 years, ever since Grandpa Roy passed. Nelson had put off clearing it out longer than he should have, longer than was reasonable, but grief had a way of making avoidance feel like reverence. Now, finally, the family home was being sold, and he had no choice. He had driven 3 hours north to the house on Clearwater Lane, armed with cardboard boxes and a promise to himself that he would not spend more than 2 days on it. The floorboard gave a different creak when he stepped on it, a hollow sound, a secret sound. He found a metal tin beneath it, the kind old men used to store fishing flies or collar stays. Inside was a folded letter he didn't read, 2 military pins, and a photograph. The photograph stopped him cold. It was black and white, but for a few streaks of color across the edges where old processing chemicals had bled. A young man stood in what looked like a summer fair with a Ferris wheel blurring in the background and strings of lights catching the long-gone sun. He was holding a stick of cotton candy up near his face, laughing at something off camera, and the laugh had been caught in perfect, devastating detail. Wide mouth, crinkled eyes, disheveled hair swept to the side with the particular carelessness of someone who had been running. His shirt collar was loose. There was a smudge of something, powdered sugar maybe, or chalk, on his left jaw. He looked maybe 19. He looked like the happiest person who had ever existed. Nelson turned the photograph over. In faded blue ink, in handwriting that was not his grandfather's, someone had written, "Tommy at the Millbrook Fair, 1987. Nelson sat down on the dusty floor without meaning to. He was an alpha. He had known that since he was 16, had learned to live inside the particular gravity of his secondary designation, the way you learn to live inside your own body, sometimes comfortably, sometimes not. He had dated. He had had relationships that were good and warm and real. He had never felt the pull. Alphas talked about the pull like it was myth or exaggeration, the kind of thing that happened in stories and old films. A bone-deep certainty, a recognition so complete it bypassed logic and went straight to the marrow. He was 34 years old, and he had begun to suspect it simply did not happen to everyone. But sitting on the floor of his grandfather's study with rain beginning to tap against the window glass, holding a photograph of a laughing stranger from 1987, Nelson felt something in his chest rearrange itself, like furniture being moved in a room that had always been just slightly wrong, settling into the configuration it was always supposed to have. He knew it made no sense. The photograph was nearly 40 years old. The boy in it would be in his mid-50s now, if he was alive at all. Nelson did not know who he was, did not know his last name, did not know a single fact about his life beyond the smudge of powdered sugar on his jaw and the name written in someone else's handwriting. He sat there for a long time, listening to the rain. Then he pulled out his phone and took a picture of the picture. He told himself he was just curious. That was the first lie. He drove home through the rain, and the lie sat in the passenger seat the whole way, quietly smug about how flimsy it was. Curious. Sure. He had also spent 20 minutes in the car before starting the engine, studying the image on his phone with a focus that had nothing to do with idle curiosity and everything to do with the rearranged furniture in his chest that kept shifting, settling, insisting it had finally found the right place. Tommy at the Millbrook Fair, 1987. He did not know his grandfather had a friend named Tommy. He searched his memory thoroughly on the drive home. Roy Hartman had talked about the war, about fishing, about the years he spent working at the lumber mill before his knee gave out. He had talked about his late wife, Nelson's grandmother, with the particular reverence of a man who had loved deeply and outlived what he loved. He had talked about his garden, his Bible, his dog. He had never mentioned anyone named Tommy. which meant Tommy might not have been his grandfather's friend at all. The handwriting on the back was different. Someone had put that photograph in that tin. But who? The question followed Nelson into his apartment, into the kitchen where he made tea he didn't drink, into the couch where he sat with his laptop open and the photograph on his phone propped against a mug for reference. Millbrook was a town about 40 miles from Clearwater Lane. The fair had likely been an annual event. Many small towns ran them through the late 80s. Finding records of a small-town fair from 1987 would take some digging, but it wasn't impossible. He told himself, again, that he was just curious. The thing about being an alpha in a world that had largely moved past the old hierarchies was that the instincts remained, even when the structures around them had evolved. Modern omegas did not need claiming or protecting or any of the things that antiquated literature insisted upon. They had lives and careers and autonomy, same as anyone, and any alpha worth a damn respected that completely. But the instincts did not get the memo. The instinct that had lodged itself in Nelson's chest after finding the photograph was patient and enormous, and not remotely interested in logic. It was very interested in Millbrook in 1987, in a boy with cotton candy and a loose shirt collar. He started with fair records. County archives held documentation of public events going back decades. And after 3 days of calls and emails and one in-person visit to a records office where a kindly woman named Doris helped him for the better part of 2 hours, he confirmed that the Millbrook Summer Fair had run annually from 1962 to 2003. Photographs from the 1987 edition had been published in the Millbrook Courier's annual summer supplement. The Millbrook Courier's archive was not digitized past 1995. He drove to Millbrook. The Courier's physical archive was kept in the basement of the town library, in filing cabinets that smelled of old paper and something faintly sweet he couldn't identify. The summer supplement for 1987 was in the third cabinet, fifth drawer. He found it in 12 minutes. His hands were not entirely steady when he unfolded it. There were 6 photographs in the supplement. He found Tommy in the 4th one. It was a wider shot, taken from a slight distance, showing a group of young men near the ring toss booth. Tommy was on the left edge, laughing again, or still, maybe, as if laughing was simply his natural state. The caption read, "Local youth enjoy the fair's opening day." Pictured L.R., Danny Marsh, Pete Holden, Tommy Holden, and Ray Kowalski. C.O. Tommy Holden. Nelson wrote the name carefully in his notebook, as if the ink would seal something. Holden was not an uncommon name, but Millbrook was a small town, and small towns had long memories. He got a coffee at the diner across from the library and asked the woman behind the counter, who introduced herself as Cora and seemed deeply interested in why a stranger was researching the 1987 summer fair, whether she knew the Holden family. "Pete and Tommy? Sure," she said, refilling a mug without being asked. "Pete still lives out on Route 9. Tommy moved away. Oh, must have been the early 90s. After everything. After everything." The words landed in a particular way that made Nelson set down his cup. "Do you know where he went?" Cora studied him with the frank, assessing look of someone who had worked a small-town diner for 30 years and developed an excellent radar for people with complicated intentions. "You family?" "No." He hesitated only a second. "I found a photograph of him. He was a friend of my grandfather's. I'm trying to return it." Not quite a lie. Not quite the whole truth either. She seemed to weigh this. "Last I heard, Tommy was up in Ashford, maybe 15 years ago, that was the word. Whether he's still there?" She shrugged. "You could ask Pete, he'd know." Pete Holden lived in a farmhouse on Route 9 that looked like it had grown out of the ground rather than being built on it. All crooked angles and layered additions, and a porch that sagged companionably on one side. He answered the door in overalls and regarded Nelson with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to reserve judgment. Nelson explained again, the photograph, the grandfather's house, the impulse to track down context. He showed Pete the image on his phone. Something moved across Pete Holden's face. Something old and complicated. "That's from the fair," he said. "I was there that day." A pause. "You said Roy Hartman was your grandfather?" "Yes." Pete looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened the door wider. "Come in." The inside of the farmhouse was lived in and warm, the kind of home where comfort had been actively chosen over tidiness, and the result was entirely pleasant. Pete poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and sat down across from Nelson at the kitchen table. "Your grandfather and my brother were friends," he said. "Good friends for a while." Roy was older than Tommy, 20 years, maybe 25, but they both worked nights at the Millbrook plant back in the early 80s, and they got close. Roy was a decent man. Another pause. He was one of the few people who was decent to Tommy when things went bad. Nelson waited. "Tommy is an omega," Pete said, with the directness of someone who had decided to simply say the thing. Back then, this town was not kind about that, especially when it became apparent that Tommy wasn't, that he didn't fit what people expected. He was too bright, too himself. People don't always forgive that. The lines around his mouth deepened. He left in '92. Things had gotten difficult. Roy helped him go. Gave him money. Gave him a reference. Didn't ask for anything in return. The rearranged furniture in Nelson's chest shifted again, very quietly. "Is he in Ashford?" Nelson asked. "Last I knew, he was." Pete studied him with those careful eyes. "Why do you really want to find him?" The honest answer arrived before Nelson could shape something more measured. "I don't fully understand it yet," he said, "but I have a feeling I'm supposed to." Pete looked at him for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. He wrote down an address. Ashford was a mid-sized city 2 hours northeast of Millbrook. The kind of place that had reinvented itself 3 or 4 times over the decades and bore the marks of each reinvention in its architecture. Old brick warehouses converted to galleries, new glass towers next to Victorian storefronts, a waterfront that smelled of industry and something sweeter underneath. Nelson drove there on a Saturday. He had spent a week since meeting Pete Holden in a state he could only describe as restless. He slept poorly. He went to the gym at 6 in the morning and then found himself standing in the shower afterward with his forehead against the cool tile, the photograph open on his phone on the edge of the sink, studying the same face he had studied 100 times. He ate meals he didn't taste. He had 2 conversations with his best friend Dara that went in circles, because he could not explain what was happening without sounding unhinged, and yet the alternative, saying nothing, pretending the pull was not pulling, felt worse. "You found a photo of a stranger and now you're driving to a different city to look for him," Dara said on the second circular phone call. "When you say it like that." "I'm saying it exactly like what it is, Nelson. I know. Is this an alpha thing?" He pressed his thumb against the edge of his phone. "I think it might be." A long pause. "Okay," Dara said, in the tone of someone deciding to suspend disbelief. "Just be a decent person about it. Don't be weird. I'm going to try very hard not to be weird. You're already driving to a different city for a stranger from a 40-year-old photograph. The bar has been set." He laughed, which was the first time he had done that in a week. "Thanks, Dara. Come back in one piece. Emotionally and otherwise." The address Pete had given him was for a ceramics studio in the warehouse district. Nelson sat in his car outside for 10 minutes before going in. The studio occupied the ground floor of a wide brick building with large windows that let in the morning light. Through the glass he could see shelves of finished work, bowls and mugs and larger sculptural pieces. And at the back, behind a low counter, a figure working at a wheel. He got out of the car. The bell above the door announced him. The figure at the wheel looked up, and Nelson's entire internal landscape shifted on its axis like a compass finding north. He was in his mid-50s now. The cotton candy boy from the fair had become a man with silver threading through dark hair and lines beside his eyes that looked like they had been carved by both laughter and harder things. He was wearing a clay-streaked apron over a blue Henley, and his hands, still on the wheel, were coated in wet gray clay. His eyes were the color of old amber, brown and gold and deep, catching the studio light. He looked nothing like the photograph and completely like the photograph. He was the most beautiful thing Nelson had ever seen in his life, And he was also terrifyingly a real and specific person standing 6 feet away and looking at him with polite, curious attention that was about to become something else entirely because Nelson was standing in his doorway with the expression of a man who had just been struck by lightning. "Can I help you?" Tommy Holden asked. His voice was quiet and a little warm, the voice of someone who had settled into themselves over a long time. Nelson opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "My name is Nelson Hartman," he said. "Roy Hartman was my grandfather." The amber eyes changed. Tommy turned off the wheel. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way a person moves when they need a moment to arrange themselves. He wiped his hands on a cloth that hung from the apron pocket, and he looked at Nelson with an expression that was careful and complex and not unwelcoming. "Roy Hartman," he said. The name in his mouth had weight. "He passed 11 years ago." Tommy nodded, once. "I know. Pete told me." He looked down at his hands, then back up. "I sent flowers. I didn't think I should come." Nelson stepped further into the studio. It smelled of clay and something mineral and faint traces of coffee from a machine on the back counter. He walked slowly, not wanting to crowd the space. "I'm cleaning out his house. It's being sold. I found a photograph." He pulled up the image on his phone and held it out. Tommy crossed the studio to look at it. He was close now, 3 feet, 2 feet, and Nelson's alpha instincts were conducting a full orchestral performance behind his sternum that he was exercising considerable effort to keep off his face. Tommy smelled of clay and cedar and something underneath both of those things, something that reached into the oldest and most animal part of Nelson's brain and said, "Here. This. Finally." Tommy looked at the photograph for a long time. When he looked up, there were tears in his amber eyes, but his face was steady. "I remember that day," he said. "Your grandfather won a stuffed bear at the ring toss and gave it to a little girl he didn't know because she was crying. That's the kind of man he was." A pause. "Where did you find this?" "Under the floorboards of his study. In a tin." Tommy's mouth curved slightly. Grief and affection folded together. Of course it was. He handed the phone back carefully. He kept everything that mattered in strange places. A breath. "Thank you for bringing it. You drove from?" 3 hours south. I was in Millbrook first. I talked to Pete." Tommy's expression shifted. "Pete sent you here?" "He gave me the address." "Did he?" It wasn't quite a question. Tommy looked at him with a different quality of attention now. The assessing, layered attention of someone who had spent decades learning to read people carefully, an Omega who had lived in an unkind world and survived it. "Why did you want to find me?" The honest answer arrived again, the same way it had with Pete, bypassing his more diplomatic faculties entirely. "I'm still working that out," he said. "But I think my grandfather kept the photograph on purpose, and I think I was supposed to find it." Silence. The morning light moved through the studio windows. A piece of clay-wet pottery sat silent on the wheel. "That's either a beautiful answer or a very good line," Tommy said at last. "I don't run lines," Nelson said. "I'm not particularly good at them." Another pause. Then, slowly, the corners of Tommy's mouth lifted, and it was the laugh from the photograph, or the edge of it, the same lived-in warmth wearing new lines and a lifetime of experience. "Do you want coffee?" he said. The coffee was good. They sat on stools at the back counter, 2 mismatched mugs between them, and Nelson learned Tommy Holden in the increments that real people reveal themselves, the pauses before certain words, the way humor rose and retreated behind his eyes, the small, precise gestures his clay-stained hands made when he was thinking. Tommy had left Millbrook in 1992. He had spent 2 years in the city before finding his footing, working in a restaurant, then in a pottery supply shop, then taking night classes. He had studied ceramics formally for 3 years, then apprenticed with a woman in Vermont who made the best utilitarian ware in the state. He had opened the studio 12 years ago. He had built a life. A real, rooted, complete life, assembled piece by piece out of the wreckage of a beginning that had not been easy. Nelson listened with his whole body. He told his own things when Tommy asked, "The architectural firm, the apartment in the city, The way he had always been more at ease in structured spaces, the grandfather who had been the steadiest presence in his childhood. When he talked about Roy, something happened in Tommy's face that Nelson recognized as tenderness. "He used to bring me books," Tommy said quietly. "Just paperbacks he'd finished, nothing fancy. He knew I liked reading. He never made it a production. He'd just set them on my workbench at the plant and walk away, like it wasn't anything." A pause. "It was everything." "That sounds like him," Nelson said, and meant it. They talked for 2 hours. When Nelson finally looked at his phone, he was startled by the time. He had told himself he would spend an hour in Ashford. "I should let you get back to your work," he said. Tommy glanced at the wheel, at the half-formed piece sitting dry and patient. "It'll keep." He looked back at Nelson with those amber eyes that had been watching him all morning with increasing directness, as if he was deciding something. "Are you driving back today?" "I was planning to. There's a good restaurant 2 blocks over, if you're hungry before you go." It was a simple offer. It was not simple at all. "I'm hungry," Nelson said. The restaurant was called Greer's, and it was the kind of place that had been there long enough to develop a personality. Mismatched chairs, walls covered in local art, a chalkboard menu that changed with the season. They sat at a corner table and ordered without much deliberation, and the conversation picked up where it had left off, effortlessly, as if it was a conversation they had already been having for years and were simply continuing. Tommy had opinions about architecture that were pointed and well-reasoned, and slightly at odds with Nelson's own. "I think most contemporary commercial buildings are afraid of texture," Tommy said. "Everything is glass and smooth edges. There's no place for the eye to rest." "There's a structural argument for glass and smooth edges," Nelson said. "Thermal efficiency, maintenance costs. The structural argument isn't the same as the aesthetic argument. They're not unrelated." "I didn't say they were related. I said they weren't the same." Tommy looked at him over the rim of his mug with something that was almost a challenge. "Do you actually like most of the buildings you design, or do you like the problem of designing them?" Nelson stopped. It was the right question. It was a question that reached through 12 years of professional identity and touched something he kept behind his work ethic. "Both," he said honestly, "but the problem more, usually." Tommy nodded, as if this was what he had suspected. "I thought so." "How did you?" "The way you talk about the structural argument, you get brighter. The aesthetic is secondary to the engineering." He set down his mug. "Nothing wrong with that. I just wondered." Nelson looked at him. He was direct, this man, not aggressive, not reckless, but direct in the way of someone who had spent too long not being allowed to be and had finally grown fully into it. It was deeply attractive and also a little destabilizing, because Nelson was used to being the most observant person in a room, and Tommy was watching him with at least as much precision as he was being watched. "What about you?" Nelson said. "The ceramics. Is it the problem or the aesthetic?" "Both," Tommy said, mirroring him perfectly. "But for me, it's the opposite. The aesthetic more, the feel of the piece." A slight smile. "The problem is interesting. The object is what I'm after. The object you hold. The object someone holds. That's the point of utilitarian wear. It goes into a kitchen, into someone's hands, every morning. If you make it right, they don't think about it. It just feels correct." A pause. "That's what I want. Something that feels correct without anyone being able to say exactly why." The words moved through Nelson like something physical, something that feels correct without anyone being able to say exactly why. He looked across the table at Tommy Holden, clay still faint at his wrist, silver in his hair, amber eyes watchful and warm and complicated, and thought, yes, precisely. They walked back to the studio after lunch. The afternoon had warmed, and Ashford's warehouse district had the particular weekend energy of a neighborhood that was half working and half alive. Artists and dog walkers and cyclists, all coexisting in the wide, brick-lined streets. At the studio door, they stopped. "This was," Nelson began. "Yes," Tommy said, simply, without embellishment. A pause. The afternoon hung between them like something not quite finished. "I'd like to come back," Nelson said. If that would be all right? Tommy looked at him for a long moment. The assessing quality was back, layered and careful, and Nelson stood in it without flinching, which felt important. To let himself be read without managing the impression. "You're Roy Hartman's grandson," Tommy said at last. "And you drove 3 hours on a Saturday to return a photograph, and you talked to Pete first, and you asked questions before you showed up on my doorstep." A slight pause. "And you sat in the coffee for 2 hours this morning, and you didn't once make me feel like you were deciding something about me." Nelson waited. "I'd like that," Tommy said. "Yes, come back." He went inside. The door closed softly. Nelson stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his hands in his pockets and the afternoon around him and the rearranged furniture in his chest sitting perfectly, completely still. Then he walked back to his car. He came back 3 weeks later. He texted first. Tommy had given him his number before he left, scrawled on a piece of brown paper bag with the pen from the counter. And they traded messages for 3 weeks that began as practical and became something else entirely with a gradualness that felt both inevitable and extremely deliberate on both their parts. Tommy sent him pictures of work in progress. A series of wide, low bowls with a particular glaze he was developing, somewhere between gray and blue depending on the light. Nelson sent him photographs of a building he was working on, a small arts center in the city's south end, and received back a response that was 3 paragraphs of thoughtful, specific engagement that left him reading it at his desk with a smile he was glad no one could see. "The entry corridor is very efficient," Tommy wrote. "I'm not sure that's what an art center should feel like walking in. Shouldn't entering be a little like arriving somewhere? A little ceremonial?" Nelson stared at his own drawings for an hour after that. Then he redesigned the entry. His project manager asked what changed. "Fresh eyes," Nelson said. His project manager gave him a look that suggested she was not entirely persuaded. The second visit was a Saturday again, but later in the day. Tommy had a morning class in the studio, teaching 6 intermediate students the fundamentals of centering, and Nelson arrived at noon when the students were leaving. He stood to one side and watched the last of the session, unnoticed, while Tommy guided a woman in her 30s through the particular problem of learning not to fight the clay. "You're using your arms," Tommy was saying, patient and close. "The strength comes from your center, not your arms. Let your body be the anchor and let your hands follow." Nelson watched the woman's shoulders gradually release, watched the wobbling form on the wheel slowly comply. Something about the moment was profoundly private, and he felt a little like a thief for witnessing it. But he could not look away. Tommy looked up and found him watching, and a slow warmth moved across his face that Nelson carried for the rest of the day like something he'd been given. Lunch again. The same restaurant. The same corner table, which they claimed with the ease of people who were already establishing habits. Different conversation, deeper conversation, the kind that happens when the surface pleasantries are already spent and what's left is real. Tommy talked about leaving Millbrook. He was careful about it, measured, but he did not avoid it, and Nelson listened with total attention. The years at the plant, after the town's reception of his designation, had become an ongoing, quiet cruelty. Small things, the kind that are easy to dismiss individually and devastating in accumulation. Words at the wrong moment, exclusions from ordinary social fabric, the particular loneliness of being in a place where you are known but not recognized. "Roy never did any of that," Tommy said. "He never looked at me differently after he knew. He was just," he turned his mug in his hands, "constant, the way some people are. You don't realize how rare that is until later." "He was like that with me too," Nelson said. "I was a strange kid, very internal. He never tried to fix that. He'd take me fishing, and we'd sit for 3 hours and barely talk, and he was completely at ease with the silence." Tommy looked at him. "Are you still an internal person?" "Very much." "You don't seem it, talking to me." Nelson considered this. "I'm not usually like this," he admitted. He stopped. "It's what?" He met Tommy's eyes across the table. "You're easy to talk to. Which is not something I say about many people. Or, frankly, anyone." Tommy was quiet for a moment. Then, "I feel the same." They held that for a moment, the two of them in the corner of Greer's on a Saturday afternoon, with the ambient noise of the restaurant around them, and something quiet and enormous between them that neither of them was naming yet. There were 3 more visits before Nelson said the thing that needed to be said. Each one left him less stable and more certain in equal measure. Less stable because Tommy Holden had a way of taking up residence in his attention that displaced nearly everything else. More certain because every hour in his company deepened the conviction that this was not coincidence and not infatuation and not the ordinary beginning of an ordinary thing. He was falling in love. He had done that before, slowly and reasonably, with people he had chosen after careful consideration. This was different. This felt like being recognized rather than chosen, like being seen by someone who had not been looking for him and had seen him anyway. Tommy was careful, not cold, never cold, but careful in the way of someone who had been hurt in ways that left lasting marks and had built his life on his own terms afterward and was not willing to let that be disrupted without very good reason. He was warm, and he was present, and he was funny in a dry, precise way that kept catching Nelson off guard. He was also keeping a specific distance, not obvious, not pointed, but there, as if he needed to be sure of something before he let that last foot between them go. Nelson respected it. He was also, quietly, running out of visits. The 5th Saturday, they walked along the waterfront after lunch. The afternoon was golden and mild, the early autumn light doing what it did to water, turning everything amber and slight. Tommy walked with his hands in his jacket pockets, and they were close enough that their arms occasionally brushed. "Tell me something about yourself you don't usually tell people," Tommy said. Out of nowhere, in the comfortable way things came out of nowhere between them. Nelson thought about it properly. "I still draw in sketchbooks," he said. "Buildings, not client work, just buildings I make up, structures I'll never build. I've done it since I was 12. Can I see one? Someday maybe." Tommy glanced at him. "Why not now? I'd need to be braver." "Are you not brave?" "Not about that." A pause. "I'm brave about most things, but the sketchbooks are—" He tried to find the word. "They're what I do when no one's looking. Showing them to someone changes what they are." Tommy was quiet for a moment, walking. "I understand that exactly," he said. "I have clay pieces I've made that I've never shown anyone, not even in the studio. They're too specifically mine. What do you do with them?" "Put them on the shelf in my kitchen and look at them every morning." Nelson looked at him. "That's the kindest thing you can do for something that belongs to you." Tommy stopped walking. He turned to look at Nelson with an expression that was layered and direct and searching, and Nelson stood still and let himself be searched. The waterfront was around them, and the amber light was on both of them, and something had just shifted into a space they had been approaching for months without having words for. "I need to ask you something," Tommy said. "Okay. Why did you come to Ashford the first time?" He paused. "Really? Not the version you told Pete?" Nelson took a breath. He looked at the water for a moment, then back. "Because I found a photograph of you," he said, "and something happened to me that I don't have a neat explanation for, something that felt like recognition. I know how that sounds. I know you're a person and not a feeling I had. I know the difference between projection and something real, and I know I was a stranger when I walked through that door, and that is not nothing." Another breath. "But I came because I felt like I was supposed to, because something in me said there's the way a compass says north. And I have spent my life being a rational person, and I could not explain that away." Tommy looked at him. His amber eyes were very still. "You're an alpha," he said. "Yes. And you're telling me you felt the pull." He did not look away. "Yes." Tommy was silent for a long time. The waterfront moved around them. A gull called somewhere over the water. "I felt something too," Tommy said finally. "When you walked into the studio. Not the same thing. It's different for Omegas the way it works. More like—" He searched for words. "Like a door opening in a room you had closed." Nelson's heart did something he could not describe. "I've been afraid of that," Tommy said. "I want to be honest about that. I was afraid of it. And I spent 3 months figuring out if you were something that would hold. a long look. I think you might be. I am, Nelson said. I know that's a presumptuous thing to say. It is. But say it again. I am, he said. The door that Tommy had described as opening moved a little wider. Tommy reached out. His clay-stained hand, warm and specific, wrapped around Nelson's wrist. Not a dramatic gesture, not a climax, just a hand on a wrist, certain and quiet, above the waterfront with the amber light on both of them. Okay, Tommy said. The word okay contained many things. It contained their first dinner that was not lunch and therefore was not ambiguous. A restaurant. Tommy chose nicer than Greer's, with candles on the table that neither of them mentioned because mentioning them would have made the moment self-conscious, and they had come too far for self-consciousness. It contained the walk after dinner, which ended at Tommy's studio building, and the moment on the steps where Nelson stood one step below and they were eye to eye, and the space between them was very small, and Tommy looked at him with those amber eyes for a long time before saying, with the gentle precision that was very specifically him, not tonight, but close. And then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Nelson's, briefly, deliberately, and the contact was barely anything and was completely everything. Nelson walked back to his car with the careful steadiness of a man carrying something full to the rim. It contained the drive home in the dark and the text that arrived before he reached the highway, "Drive safe. I'll see you next Saturday." It contained the next Saturday, which Nelson drove to Ashford for, in the morning arriving before noon, and Tommy was outside on the step with 2 coffees from the cafe around the corner, as if he had been waiting. As if this too had always been the plan. They spent the day in the studio, not talking much. Tommy worked at the wheel and Nelson sat in the corner on a stool with his sketchbook. He had brought it, finally, and drew, and they were simply in the same space. Quiet and comfortable and present to each other without the obligation of performance. Occasionally, Tommy would say something. Occasionally, Nelson would respond. The silences between were not empty. Late in the afternoon, Tommy came and stood behind Nelson's shoulder. Nelson tensed slightly, then made himself be still. "May I?" Tommy asked. Meaning, the sketchbook. Nelson turned it toward him. Tommy looked at the drawings for a long time. Structures that curved in ways real buildings rarely did. Towers with impractical organic proportions. A cathedral made of something that might have been glass or stone or both. A bridge that appeared to grow from the riverbanks rather than span them. "These are extraordinary," Tommy said quietly. "They're impractical." Not every extraordinary thing is practical. He looked at Nelson. "These are what you want to build. Some version of them. You should build them. Say simply, without hesitation, you should find the commission that lets you build something like this, and you should do it. It's not that easy. I know it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it's what you should do." Tommy met his eyes. "You're very good at what you do. You should also do what you love." Nelson looked at him. The afternoon light was on his silver-threaded hair and his calm, direct face, and Nelson thought, how did you spend 40 years existing and not intersecting with my life until now? What was I doing? What were we both doing? "You're very sure about things," he said. "I spent a long time not being allowed to be," Tommy said. "Now I am, by choice." A pause. "You can be sure too, you know. About the things that are worth being sure about." He said it simply, looking at Nelson with those layered amber eyes. And Nelson understood that they were not purely talking about buildings. "I am," Nelson said, very quietly. "About some things." Tommy picked up his coffee. "I know," he said, and turned back to his wheel. It happened a month after the waterfront. Nelson had mentioned carefully and without pressure that he would be in Ashford on a Thursday for a site visit with a contractor in the Arts Center project and would be staying overnight rather than driving back in the dark, and that he had a hotel room already sorted, all said in the tone of someone who was not proposing anything, simply sharing information. Tommy had texted back, "Have dinner with me instead. At mine, I'll cook," which was how Nelson found himself standing in Tommy's apartment above the studio on a Thursday evening in October. and how he found the shelf. The apartment was compact and considered, every object in it purposeful, the kind of space that reflects how its inhabitant thinks. Books stacked by size rather than subject. A single large painting on the main wall. Abstract, green and gray. A kitchen where everything worked and nothing was decorative except for one shelf, low on the wall, where a row of ceramic pieces stood. Nelson stopped in front of it while Tommy was stirring something on the stove. The pieces were different from the studio work. Smaller, more intensely made, not functional exactly, not purely sculptural, something in between. They had the quality of things made without an audience. The quality Tommy had described on the waterfront when he said he had pieces he never showed anyone. Pieces, too, specifically his. The textures were extraordinary. Nelson looked at each one slowly. A small bottle with a surface like bark, or maybe skin. A low dish the color of winter sky, so thin it was nearly translucent. A figure, barely recognizable as a figure, more like the idea of a person suggested in clay with its hands open. "Those are from my first years in Ashford," Tommy said from the stove. He had come to stand in the kitchen doorway, the years when I was working out how to be something. "They're the best things I've seen you make," Nelson said. "The students never see them." "I know." "You said they were yours." "Yes." A pause. "But I wanted you to see them." Nelson turned from the shelf. Tommy was in the doorway with an oven cloth in his hand and a careful expression that was also, underneath the care, completely open, more open than Nelson had seen him, more undisguised. "Thank you," Nelson said. He meant it the way the word needed to be meant, not as a pleasantry, as a recognition of what had been offered. Tommy held his gaze for a moment. Then he turned back to the stove. 10 more minutes, he said. "Open the wine." Dinner was pasta and roasted vegetables and bread from a bakery around the corner, and it was the best meal Nelson had eaten in months, not because of the food, but because of the table. Because of the two of them at it, no restaurant around them, no need to manage the space or the impression. Just Tommy's kitchen, and the low light, and the wine, and the conversation that moved through 12 different subjects without effort. They talked about Roy Hartman for a long while. Longer than they had in all the previous conversations combined. Tommy talked about the early 80s at the plant, the long night shifts, the way his friendship with Roy had developed from the shared silence of a night shift rhythm into something with real substance. "He knew I was an Omega," Tommy said, before I had said it to anyone else. He noticed, the way perceptive people do, and he never made it a referendum. He just adjusted his behavior, slightly, in ways that made things easier, without drawing attention to it. A quiet pause. When I started having difficulties with some of the others, he was the first person I told. He got extremely quiet in the way he did when he was angry. "Your grandfather's version of angry was silence, did you know that?" "Yes," Nelson said. "His version of very pleased was also silence. He was economical." Deeply. A slight smile. "He told me that whether I stayed or left was entirely my choice, and that either way I would be fine, and he said it in the particular way that made you believe it even when you didn't believe anything. And then he said that if I chose to go, he would help. And he did. He gave you money," Nelson said, "and the name of a cousin in the city who had a spare room, and 3 boxes of books." A long pause. "He hugged me when I left. He was not a man who hugged easily." Tommy's voice shifted slightly, not breaking but deepening. "I think about that sometimes. That it was the most he could have done." Nelson reached across the table. He covered Tommy's hand with his, carefully, the way he had learned Tommy received things, with space around the gesture, without force. Tommy turned his hand over, held back. After dinner they sat on the couch with the remains of the wine and the low lamp, and talked less, and eventually didn't talk at all. Just sat in the comfortable quiet that had been growing between them for months, and at some point Nelson became aware that Tommy had moved gradually closer across the cushions and was now near enough that their shoulders were touching. He didn't move, neither did Tommy. The lamp made warm light. "Tell me about your grandfather," Tommy said softly after a while. "You knew him better than I thought I did." "I knew the Roy who worked nights at a plant in his 50s. You knew Roy Hartman all your life." A pause. Tell me the private things, the ones I didn't know, Nelson thought. He smelled like tobacco and sawdust even when he hadn't worked in years, he said. He kept the same dog for 17 years, and when she died, he couldn't talk about it for 6 months. He had strong opinions about weather and almost no opinions about politics. He used to sit at the kitchen table in the early morning before anyone else was up with his Bible and his coffee and the first light. And if you came in, he would look up and make room for you without saying anything. He paused. I used to come in on purpose, just to be in that room with him, in that light. Tommy was quiet for a moment. He sounds like the same person, he said, just in a different room. Nelson looked at the side of his face. He was. Tommy turned to look back. They were close, a specific kind of close. I'm glad you found the photograph, Tommy said. I'm glad I was the one who went to clean out the study, Nelson said. It had been 11 years. I kept putting it off. I almost put it off again this time. What changed? He held Tommy's gaze. I had a feeling, he said. Tommy looked at him, amber and considering, for a long breath. Then he leaned forward and pressed his mouth against Nelson's briefly and with absolute intention, and Nelson brought his hand up to the side of Tommy's face and held there. And they stayed like that for a moment, not deepening it, not rushing, just the simple, extraordinary fact of it. When they separated, Tommy had the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had put it down. There it is, he said softly. There it is, Nelson agreed. He did not drive home that night. He stayed in the apartment, in the spare room that Tommy had quietly made up while Nelson was washing the dinner dishes. Clean sheets and a blanket folded at the foot of the bed and a glass of water on the nightstand. The particular tenderness of someone who takes care without flourish. In the morning, Tommy made eggs and toast, and they sat at the kitchen table in the early light. The same configuration Nelson had described his grandfather at his own kitchen table. Making room without asking, and drank coffee and did not say much because nothing needed to be said. Nelson drove back to the city at 9. He had a meeting at 10:30. He sat through it with complete professional competence and approximately 30% of his attention. The rest still in Ashford in a kitchen with a glass of water on the nightstand and the shelf of pieces that were too specifically Tommy's for anyone else to see until now. Dara called him at lunch. You have a look, she said, which was a strange thing to say on a phone call, and then, I can hear it. You have the voice version of a look. Did something happen? Things are developing, he said. Define developing. Positively. A pause. Nelson. Are you smiling right now? Possibly. Oh my God, the photograph man. His name is Tommy. The photograph man has a name. He could hear her grinning. Tell me everything, sometime, not right now. But things are. Yes, he said, things are. Things are. The development was not swift. They were both people who moved through things carefully, who had learned from experience that fast was not the same as right, that the architecture of something lasting needed proper foundations. They took their time with each other the way Tommy took time with a glaze, testing it at each stage, checking the quality of what was forming. But the time between visits shortened. Tommy started calling, not just texting, casual calls, sometimes in the evening, that would run for an hour without Nelson noticing the time passing. Nelson started keeping space in his schedule with a deliberateness he'd never applied to anyone before, blocking Saturdays and the occasional Thursday with a firmness his assistant noted, with raised eyebrows and zero comment. He drove to Ashford, and sometimes Tommy drove to the city and they found each other's cities together. Tommy standing in the Arts Center construction site in February with a hard hat on and his hands in his pockets, while Nelson explained the entry corridor redesign, which now had a subtle curve, a ceremonial feeling, an arrival, and saying, yes, that's it, that's what it needed, and Nelson teaching Tommy the grid of his city neighborhood on a Sunday afternoon, the coffee place and the bookshop and the strange old hardware store that had been there since 1962 and showed no signs of caring about the 21st century. This is yours, Tommy said, in the hardware store, running his thumb along the edge of an old measuring tape hanging from a pegboard hook. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this is where you live. This is the texture of your daily life." He looked around the store with his particular attention, absorbing it. "I'm learning you." Nelson looked at him among the ordered clutter of the hardware store with the fluorescent lights and the wooden floors and the smell of metal and oil. "Are you always like this? Paying attention like this?" "Yes," Tommy said simply. "It's a bit. I know. I like it," Nelson said. Tommy smiled. The cotton candy fair smile, the newspaper photograph smile, in a hardware store in the city on a Sunday, wearing a jacket Nelson had given him because the morning had been cold. Spring came. He went back to Clearwater Lane one more time. The house had sold by then. He was not going back to the house. He went back to Millbrook, to Pete Holden's farmhouse on Route 9, and sat at Pete's kitchen table again with 2 cups of coffee between them. He told Pete about the past 8 months. Not everything. Some things belonged only to Ashford and a certain apartment and a shelf with clay pieces on it, but the shape of it, the way the photograph had pulled him across the distance, the way Tommy had been careful and deliberate and then, finally, open. Pete listened with those careful eyes. He had the same quality Tommy had, of paying attention without performing it. "Roy would have wanted this," Pete said, when Nelson had finished. He worried about Tommy. Even years later, he used to wonder. He couldn't reach out himself. Too much time had passed. Too much had shifted. But he always wondered. "He kept the photograph," Nelson said. "He kept the photograph," Pete agreed. "Under the floor. In the tin." Nelson looked at his coffee. "Do you think he knew? What would happen if someone found it?" Pete was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the spring wind moved through the trees at the edge of the property, and the farmhouse creaked slightly on its old bones. "Roy Hartman," Pete said slowly, "was not a man who did things without considering them." Pause. "Put it this way, he knew he was getting old. He knew someone was going to clean out that house eventually. And he put that photograph in the safest place he had. Safe enough that it would last, not so safe that it would be forever unfindable." A slight pause. He was a deliberate man. Nelson sat with that for a while. Roy Hartman at his kitchen table in the early morning light with his Bible and his coffee, making room without asking. Roy Hartman winning a stuffed bear at the ring toss and giving it to a child he didn't know. Roy Hartman putting money in Tommy Holden's hand and the name of a cousin in the city and telling him he would be fine in the particular way that made you believe it. Roy Hartman pressing a photograph into a tin and sealing it under a floorboard in a study that smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. Where it would wait 11 years for a grandson who had always been careful and serious and internal, a grandson who had never felt the pull to finally come and find it. He was a deliberate man, Nelson agreed. He called Tommy from the car outside Pete's farmhouse. Tommy picked up on the second ring. "How did it go?" His voice was warm, immediate. "Good," Nelson said. He looked out at the Route 9 farmhouse with its crooked additions and its sagging porch. "I think my grandfather left the photograph on purpose." A pause. "What do you mean?" He told him what Pete had said. The deliberate man. The tin under the floorboard. The careful positioning between unfindable and unfound. Tommy was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had the depth of someone feeling something large moving through them. He always was looking out for things, he said quietly, even when he wasn't there to do it. "Yes." Another pause. "Nelson." "Yeah. Come to Ashford." Not a question, not quite a demand. Just an invitation offered with all of Tommy's particular directness. The directness of a person who has earned the right to say what they mean. "I'm 2 hours away," Nelson said. "I know where you are." He turned the key in the ignition. "I'll be there in 2 hours." "I'll be here," Tommy said. "I'm making soup." And that, the absolute ordinary complete warmth of it, "I'll be here, I'm making soup," was the thing that undid him finally, sitting in the car outside a farmhouse on Route 9 in the May afternoon. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hand, and the window cracked, and the spring wind, and the 2 hours of road between him and a kitchen that smelled of cedar and clay and the particular person who had become, with such careful, gradual certainty, the north on his compass. Then he drove. Summer again. Not the summer of the photograph. Not 1987 with its fair lights and cotton candy and a laughing 19-year-old who did not yet know all the things the years would bring, but a different summer, a current one, with its own quality of light. Ashford in July was warm and green, and the warehouse district smelled of the river and the coffee cafe around the corner from the studio, and Nelson had a key to the building now, which he used on Saturday mornings to come in early before Tommy was properly awake and make coffee and sit on the studio stool, and sometimes draw in his sketchbook, and sometimes just sit. Tommy would come down in his clay-streaked clothes still settling into the morning and see him there and not say anything. Just make his way to the coffee and pour a cup and come to sit near him. And they would be in the same quiet together, the way Nelson had been with his grandfather at that kitchen table in the early light, making room without asking. He loved him. He had known it for months and had said it the way it needed to be said. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just in the kitchen one evening while Tommy was stirring something on the stove with his back turned, said it as if it was a simple, factual statement, which it was. Tommy had turned around and looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. "I love you too." And turned back to the stove, which was, Nelson thought, exactly right. The photograph lived on the shelf with the clay pieces now. Tommy had put it there himself, propped against the small bottle with the bark-like surface, the photograph a little faded, but the face in it clear. A 19-year-old laughing at something off-camera, cotton candy in hand. Powdered sugar on his jaw, a Ferris wheel blurring in the summer sky behind him. Tommy at the Millbrook Fair, 1987. Tommy caught in the exact moment of a laugh that had survived decades in a tin under a floorboard, waiting for something, waiting for someone who would drive 3 hours on a Saturday to return it. Nelson looked at it sometimes and thought about his grandfather in the early morning with his Bible and his coffee. Thought about deliberate men and the things they arrange in the shape of care. Thought about the specific patience of Roy Hartman, who had loved a man he could not follow into his future and had done the next possible thing, left behind a door for someone else to open. Tommy came to stand beside him one evening when he was looking at the photograph. He slipped his hand into Nelson's, and they stood together looking at the boy in the picture who had become, over a lifetime of quiet, persistent survival, the man at his side. "He looks happy," Nelson said. "He was," Tommy said. "That day, he was." A pause. "He's happy again too, for the record." Nelson looked at him. The amber eyes, the silver hair, the lines that were carved by both laughter and harder things. The most specific, deliberate, entirely real person he had ever stood next to in his life. "Good," Nelson said. Tommy squeezed his hand. The summer light fell through the studio window. The same light it always was landing on the shelf, with the clay pieces and the photograph, and the two of them standing in front of it, not at a fair. Not in a summer long gone, but here in the only time that had ever mattered, the present one which was continuing. The compass had found its north. The door had opened. Nuths. Nuths. The door had opened. R. Roy Hartman had been a deliberate man. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, make sure to join our Patreon. Link is in the description. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.